that direct our path in this modern world. When I began my vocational career as a pastor of churches, my very first assignment was to a church where I was the associate pastor, and I worked with a senior pastor who seemed to be pretty old to me. He was 3 years older than I am right now, so now I think he was a pretty young guy. But he had grown up in a small town in the southwestern corner of Virginia that if you pronounce it the way it's written, you would call Saltville, but it's pronounced Salville. And it's spelled with the word salt, like you would find on your table, ville. But he and so many people who had grown up there had become familiar enough with it to let it blur a little bit. When I first came here, in those first few videos, because my first Sundays here were online-only worship services, I got a helpful email from someone who said, "You're doing a great job being careful about your enunciation and diction, but nobody else pronounces it Maryville." So I learned very early on that one of our habits here is to let it elide a little bit. So just like this is Maryville, that was Salville. And he was describing in a book that he wrote his experience growing up in that small town of Saltville by using those 10 commandments of God as the backdrop for his small town life. And his book is called The Shakers Play Better in the Rain. Isn't that cool? The high school was known as the Saltville Shakers. So he describes his experience with various people and with various circumstances in his life. And in his growing up years in the 1950s and 60s, that small town of Saltville, which, by the way, is a place where salt comes up out of the ground in the water. There are salt wells and salt ponds. And from the earliest years of human civilization, people went there as animals went there as a source of salt. During the Civil War, it was a crucial place that the battling armies fought over on several occasions. But across the mountain ridge is the county seat town of Marion, Virginia. And so to get from the town of Saltville to the county seat, people had to drive a winding road with several turns along the way to get across a mountain to the next valley. He tells the story in this book of the chief of police of the Saltville Police Department, whose name was Jingo Lambert. And one day, an out-of-state guest found his way to Saltville and asked, "How do I get from here to Marion, the county seat?" Well, again, it's a winding road with several key turns that goes over a mountain. And so the chief of police started giving him instructions as if he were a native or a familiar person in the community. There was a road that starts outside of the town limits of Saltville that had a name, but locals referred to it simply as the Pike. And so this small town chief of police told the guest, "Well, you take the Pike, and when you get to the Morgan farm, bear right, and that road will take you straight to Marion." And so the out-of-town guest said, "I don't know where the Pike is, and I don't know where the Morgan farm is." And the chief of police said, "Son, if you don't know where the Morgan farm is, I don't know how to tell you to get to Marion." And that could happen in any small town where people are insiders and know the language and know the geography. But it could also happen in any moment of our lives in which there's a familiarity. We become so accustomed to the mile markers and to the way markers in our own lives that they become second nature to us and maybe even first nature to us. But we sometimes don't stop to think about how a different point of reference might not only strike a different person in a unique way, but it might actually have a unique effect upon our own lives. In this proverb that we read together, in which King Solomon or the author or the teacher of wisdom writes to the student, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." In that proverb, we hear a reminder of something that Isaiah the prophet also speaks to the people of Israel a little later in the Old Testament. In that second section of the prophecy of Isaiah, when the prophet is speaking to those people who have been away in exile and they're making their way back to Jerusalem, and he's encouraging them to come and to rebuild and to come and to settle and to make Israel and to make Judea and to make Jerusalem great again. We're familiar with a portion of chapter 55 in which the prophet says, "Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their way and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them return to the Lord, that he might have mercy on them, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon." But the next verses speak well to this focus over the next few weeks. When God says through the prophet, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." It's almost as if God is saying through the prophet that when we're trying to find God's way, we don't know where the Morgan farm is. When we're trying to find God's way, sometimes we don't know where the pike is. But the great gift of this prophecy and the great gift of this proverb is that we look to God to be the giver of directions, and we're not dependent upon someone like Jingo Lambert. We're not even dependent upon someone who has written the latest, greatest book about the Christian faith. We're not even dependent upon our Sunday school teachers or pastors. Because in looking to God, we can find that reference, that sense of direction, if we will acknowledge God, as the writer of the proverb says, in all of our paths. And in both this proverb and in Psalm 23, one of the key things that I hear is that God will lead us in those moments in which we look to God and acknowledge God. And so as we're reflecting on these two passages today, I want to challenge us to be mindful of two key circumstances in our lives over this next week and throughout this season of Lent, in which we might look to God to be the one who gives us the way or shows us the way, to be the way maker. In the proverb, we hear God saying, or we hear the teacher of wisdom saying, "In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your path." In Psalm 23, we read, "He leads me in the paths of righteousness," or in the right paths, "for his name's sake." So in those two portions of these passages, I hear that one of the keys is for us to look for God in all portions of our lives. Now, I know that we're people who try to live godly lives. But is it true of us that in all parts of our lives we acknowledge God? Is it true that in all parts of our lives we are trying to live as if our life reflects something that would be done in God's name? So I want to give you an opportunity to stop and think for a moment. In your daily routine, what parts of your life are the ones in which you most intentionally acknowledge God? What parts of your day or life are the ones in which you most intentionally try to live in God's name? And you might think about those moments of prayer at the beginning of the day, before meals, after the day has ended and you're about to fall asleep. You might think about those parts of your day in which you have the opportunity to have the conversation or to live a life of witness that reveals God to the people around you. Now do the reverse. Think about the parts of your day or routine in which you are least likely to acknowledge God. And it may be because there's a part of your day that you know so well that you're able to say, "I've got this on my own." Or it may be that it's a part of your day that feels somehow separated from your life of faith because it has to do with your technical knowledge at work. Or it has to do with the company that you're keeping that may or may not be company that is sympathetic to or in connection with the life of faith that you strive to live. Or it may be a portion of your day in which you find yourself the most stressed out, or the most angry, or the most frustrated. And as you're thinking about those portions of your day, here's the challenge for us this week. In all your ways, acknowledge God. In every part of your daily life, can you live in such a way that you're acknowledging God, or, in the words of Psalm 23, trying to follow on the right path for God's name's sake? Our striving here is to live every part of our days in such a way that we would not be ashamed to say, this represents the God of all creation. Our striving here is to live every part of our days in which we're looking to God for orientation and not trying to depend upon ourselves. Because in depending upon ourselves, we might find that we don't represent God faithfully, and we might even represent God poorly. So in all of our ways, may we turn toward God. In all of our ways of living and talking and even thinking, may we be people who are striving to be on that right path that represents God's name. The second point that I would focus, the second place of focus that I would point us toward is that in that beautiful part of the psalm in which God leads us beside the still waters and restores our soul, there are two things in that passage that are important to me. One is that in this land of Israel, in which this shepherd is caring for the sheep, there are portions of the land in which being able to find the still water might be a bit of a challenge. It might be something that sheep left to their own industry might not find. There are parts of that land that are arid and dry. So first of all, what we're hearing is that God leads us in those moments of our greatest thirst, and that God leads us, shows us the way in those moments when we most need to be restored. So in addition to striving to acknowledge God in every part of our lives, here's our second challenge. Where are the parts in your life in which you feel the greatest thirst right now? Where are the parts in your life in which you feel the greatest fatigue right now? Where are the parts of your life in which you feel the very most stale right now? Just as you're striving to make your whole life something that God could put God's name upon, maybe one of the things that we might want to do is to acknowledge before God the places where we most need to have our thirst quenched, the places where we most need to experience restoration. And maybe those are in those similar places of anger and frustration. Maybe they're in those places where we feel the very most anxious. One of the things that is a blessing to us, but also something that might get in the way of our full appreciation of these passages, is that there are very few moments in our lives when we know what it means really to be thirsty. I mean, if you walk through this building, you'll find water fountains and coffee pots and sinks. Probably the same is true in your house, that if you need a drink or want a drink, you can access it very quickly. Even on those long road trips with our children, probably the longest that they need to wait for a drink is to the next exit. So we really don't know what it means to be absolutely parched to the place of maybe not being able to go on. And that might be one of the images that is described here, of being able to have that thirst quenched in the greatest moment. In those moments where we feel the absolute driest right now, that might be the place during this Lent season where we turn to God with the absolute most urgency. Maybe you feel dry in your spiritual life and need to have a restoration moment so that you feel there's a liveliness and a vitality in your life of faith. Maybe, like Jesus describes in the Sermon on the Mount, in the next testament of the Bible, you find that this is a moment in your life or in our life together in which you hunger and thirst for righteousness. It might be a time in which you look around at the world and you're tempted to give up hope on redemption, or you're tempted to give up hope on justice, or you're tempted to give up hope on civility or upon decency, maybe that's a place where you're really thirsting right now. It's important to name those things before God so that we can experience the quenching of our thirst and the restoration of our hope. But you know better than I, what is the place in your life right now that is the most dried up and cracked and broken, that most needs God to show the way? I pray that we might offer those things up to God today, so that in the week ahead, we might not just continue wandering in the dryness, that we might not just continue wandering with emptiness inside us, but that we might experience that restoration, because rather than trusting in our own instincts or trusting in our own sense of direction through life, or saying to ourselves, I've got this, or maybe shaming ourselves by saying, I ought to be able to handle this. Here are the moments in this passage in which I feel God is most showing the way in our greatest moments of need. So our challenge going forward is to acknowledge God as the way maker in those places that we haven't yet offered up to God, or in those places where we're just absolutely thirsty and dramatically need God to show the way and to offer restoration. What if you and I were able to take this sense of direction and live our lives not only in reverence to God, but to strive to live every moment of our lives in reference to God, trusting in God to give the direction that we need, trusting in God to be the one who guides our paths, trusting in God to be the one who leads us beside those still waters that would restore us and quench our thirsts. Amen.